All right, candidates, round 7. One decisive result. That was Nakamura over Topalov. So Nakamura gets on the board for this tournament. Karyakin and Aronian drew, which is important because they were the leaders going into this round. They drew their game. They're still the leaders. Today's matchups were Giri with white against Anand, Karyakin with white against Aronian, Nakamura with white against Topalov, and Fiddler with white against Caruana. And let us proceed. Let's start with Giri Anand. Giri's now a perfect 7 for 7, 7 draws out of 7 rounds. Here with White on move 12 of it started out as a Queen's Gambit declined and morphed into some weird Nimzo Indian hybrid. Here he played the move Bishop takes f6, which obviously isn't very ambitious on account of he has the bishop pair in this position and he decides to give it back. And he decided to quickly simplify the position. Um, After bishop e2, simply knight f6 was played. The queens were traded off, and this position is just crying out basically for all of the rooks to be exchanged along the open C and D files and a draw to be agreed because the structure is basically symmetrical. Um, and yeah, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot to play for. It just looks like dead equality. So they played on for about 15 more moves, but the result was never really in doubt. That game was a draw. So the clash of the leaders, Karyakin versus Aronian, was actually drawn in the same number of moves as the previous game, but this one was a bit more interesting. This position was reached out of a King's Indian attack, which this is a fairly standard position, but this specific position hasn't been seen very often because Black moved his A pawn to A4 before playing B5, which isn't bad by any means. It's just a little bit unusual. So players have deviated from specific theory around this point, although the contours of this sort are quite well known in chess praxis. So the normal way to play this position, I suppose, would be to go e5 to close the center, and then after knight d7, then to play something like h4. This is the sort of standard plan in this variation, and then bring the knight around to h2 and into g4 and try to stir up an attack on the king side. Karyakin reversed the moves and went h4 instead, allowing Aronian the opportunity to capture on e4, which he did. And now the standard choice would be to just play d takes e4 and continue with e5, and sort of be content that after e5 push, you now potentially have the e4 square for your knight. So, for example, like d takes e4, I don't know, let's say queen c7. e5 is also very possible, but okay, let's say queen c7. Then White can demonstrate his idea by putting his knight on this square. Which is why they say in books about this opening that Black's normally not supposed to exchange here. But, I mean, obviously Aronian knows what he's doing. Probably he was intending to go e5 or something. I'm not sure, though. But anyways, Karyakin decided to really play sort of non-standard. He played knight takes e4, which is very rarely the recapture you see in this. And I mean, this opening's kind of reverse King's Indian. So if you think about the King's Indian, when White plays d captures e5 in the King's Indian, normally you see Black going d takes e5 rather than knight takes e5. Although this isn't entirely unheard of. So d takes e4 would allow a queen trade, which isn't necessarily to White's favor. So Karyakin took with the rook, which really does lead to sort of original positions. He's keeping this bishop's diagonal open, which could become relevant later. So Aronian played the natural b5 to gain space on the queen side. And Karyakin went knight g5. So he's continuing to unveil this bishop along the diagonal. So there's potential tactics starting to happen here, as well as hinting at potentially queen h5 and starting up a quick attack on the h7 point. Aronian very logically played rook a6. Again, I didn't understand this move at first, and then I remembered this bishop along the diagonal, which is a bit scary. So Aronian decides to get all his stuff off of that line. And Karyakin played queen h5, which looks, what's the word? It looks too blunt to be effective. It looks like it should just be able to be repelled by h6, and then Karyakin's forced to go back with his pieces. But I think his point is that he's arguing that h6 is a bit of a weakness. And now we can maybe consider sacrifices on h6. Other than that, I'm hard-pressed to actually understand knight g5, queen h5. But anyways, here f5 was played, which makes a lot of sense, because White, yeah, it's, again, bishop takes h6. The rook coming to g4 would make that sacrifice quite dangerous. So Aronian decides to kick the rook back and cover the g4 point so that the rook can't go there to continue attacking black's king. So the rook goes back. So basically what's happened is white put his knight on g5, he put his rook on e4, and those pieces were forced back. But with black forcing them back, some weaknesses have been created. The e6 point's a bit tender now, the e5 square, this h6 point still. So bishop d7 was played. The game should be about dynamically equal, I think. But yeah. At this point, black is threatening bishop e8 to trap the queen. So if you're wondering whether white could force a draw by capturing on h6, with the idea that this would be a perpetual, you can't on account of... maybe white could aim for more than a perpetual. But anyways, you can't do this on account of bishop e8 trapping the queen, of course. So white instead... played knight e5, so occupying the hole that black left behind by playing f5, and also allowing this queen to retreat backwards if need be. So knight e5, rook e5, bishop d6, kicking the rook back, queen f6, and yeah, it's difficult to see how white can continue his play. Black has really shored up his weaknesses nicely. This square is no longer a problem. He's got that covered up nicely. This pawn is no longer a problem. He's got that covered up nicely. The h6 point is no longer a problem. He's got that covered up nicely. And black's just overall seems to have a healthy position. So Karyakin played rook b1. Again, white shouldn't be doing too badly, but black has definitely repelled white's attempts at an attack. Rook b1 was played in order to get this bishop out. And now... Aronian decided to go for an attack of his own with f4. So this was played, at which point white's king might be looking a bit dangerous. But Karyakin manages to cover everything with queen takes c5, taking a pawn and nicely covering the f2 point. Rook f5 and queen e3. Black recaptures his pawn. Queen g3, queen h5. So basically, queen h5, yeah, queen h5 was played, and yeah, again, the game should be roughly balanced. This pawn, of course, is isolated. This pawn is isolated. Neither of them are particularly large targets. This rook is still yet to be participating. This rook is still yet to be participating. Well, it's participating a bit. But yeah, the game was drawn quickly from here. Because, again, it's difficult to target any weaknesses. So the queens were traded off, and a draw was agreed here. Because, yeah, I mean, again, there's not a whole lot to play for. After something like takes, and king f7, again, these two pawns are both isolated, but it's going to be... I'm going to go with impossible to win either of them. And aside from those, there are no real targets. And, I mean, black's got this past h-pawn, but white's king is over here, and this rook is covering along here, so it's going to be very difficult to actually make something out of this. Same with white's majority on the queen side. I feel like if he pushes these pawns forward, he'll just be creating weaknesses for himself. So a draw was a logical result here. So Svidler-Caruana was pretty exciting. It started out as an English, which, of course, has a reputation of being quiet and positional. Svidler defied all that by playing h4 here. So he's just trying to open up the h-file sack mate, as Fischer would say. So he went h5. And, yeah, now if Caruana plays f takes g6, the e6 pawn is going to be kind of weak, as well as the open h-file. So h takes g6 made sense. Although, yeah, now the h-file is entirely open, so if white can get stuff over there, he could be facing quite a strong attack. So here, Svidler played bishop h6, which makes a lot of sense. Because this bishop is the main defender of black's king, so it makes sense to exchange it off. Maybe it was a bit more accurate to go bishop g5 first, induce f6, and then to go bishop h6, and claim that the king side's a bit weaker, now that f6 has been induced and g6 is undefended. Maybe. But okay, bishop h6 was fine. So knight takes c3, b takes c3, and now f5. So basically, f5, yeah, it's a double-edged move. He's attacking the knight, and he's potentially what he's trying to do is he's allowing for defense along the 7th rank. So, like with rook f7, for example, or queen e7, he can cover stuff along here. But of course, it is quite risky because, again, it leaves the g6 pawn a bit weak. And remember, before, we were trying to induce f6 to weaken this pawn as a suggestion. And now Caruana is doing this voluntarily. So if Svidler were to move the knight, then his attack would basically be over. Because, yeah, there's not really any time for any sort of that. Knight g5, of course, would be ideal, but it doesn't work because bishop takes h6 followed by queen takes this thing. So knight g5, bishop takes h6. Yeah, and if you throw in knight takes e6, that still doesn't really help after something like this. Then it's 2 pieces for a rook, and white's attack is over. So Svidler played queen c1, sacrificing a piece and going all out for the attack down the h-file. Now, taking the knight's basically forced, otherwise white's going to get a big attack at no cost to himself. So black's got to at least get a piece for his troubles. So naturally, Svidler takes on g7 and goes queen h6 check. And yeah, this is pretty exciting. So black's king is forced to come forward because obviously if he goes back, then queen h7's mate. If he goes to f7, then actually the problem is queen h7 check and queen takes b7. Which, I mean, when you sacrifice a piece, you're not only looking to give mate, but if you can favorably win your material back, then that's good. So in this case, white will be able to take the bishop, equalize the material, and still have a huge attack, so he'd be winning in that case. So Caruana rightly played king f6, which is more or less forced. D takes e4. So basically, white's down a piece for a pawn, but black's king is sitting on f6, which is pretty bad. And yeah, this position's really, really dangerous for black. So Caruana naturally tried rook h8 to get some stuff off the board, but Svidler was not so obliging. He went e5 check. Yeah, there's only one move here because, well, if you play king takes e5, queen f4 is mate. If you play king f5, queen f4 is mate. If you play king e7, then, of course, just queen g7 check, king back, and rook takes h8 is mate. And if you play knight takes e5, then white's just going to play queen f4 check, king g7, and queen takes here. And again, it's the thing about winning your material back with benefit. So you have to play queen f6 to avoid losing this rook, actually. And then white just takes, and takes this poor bishop on b7, and is a piece up at the end of the line. So going back, that's all to show that there's only one move, and that's to play king f7, which Caruana did. And now Svidler was able to play queen f4 check. So whereas if he had to move this queen to somewhere where it's not check, black would have time to exchange off these rooks on his terms. Instead, white can keep his initiative going. He takes on h8, forces a recapture, and then castles queenside. And now he's ready to bring this rook either into d7 or into h1, depending on what black does. And yeah, black's in quite a bit of trouble because white's attacking with at least these two guys, as well as the e5 pawn, which is supporting an incursion on f6. And these guys are not doing such a good job of defending. So despite the extra piece, right now in terms of pieces participating, well, this e5 pawn is currently worth more than like these guys combined in terms of attacking the black king. King g8 was played, the rook came into d7, and yeah, now the problem is this bishop's attacked, as well as the various threats. So we're sort of forking queen f7 and the bishop. Black tried to get out of that by playing rook f8, tempoing the queen, but white played counter-tempo queen g4. So the bishop still attacked, mate is still threatened, there's still a fork going on. Black counters that by a tempo move of his own. He gives check while defending this pawn, which makes sense. White played f4, and now black's ability to give tempo is over. White is threatening the bishop, and queen takes e6. And queen takes e6 is of a higher priority, because, for example, if you move the bishop and allow queen takes e6, then actually, in addition to losing this pawn with check, you get your knight forked off. So it makes more sense to defend this guy and let the bishop fall. And then knight takes e5 was played because of the pin on the f4 pawn. And And now White's attack is more or less over. Black's managed to get his stuff into play. So White's won his material back with full interest, but his attack is over. So he's got to play queen h3. I mean, there's no other square for the queen to go other than a square where he's inviting a queen trade. But, I mean, surely enough, the ending is quite good for him on account of this rook is really active. This pawn is weak, and White's weaknesses are really not easily targeted. And with pawns on both sides of the board being open, and so many weaknesses to attack, this bishop is much stronger than the knight. In addition to this rook being much more active than this rook at the moment. So Svidler had a significant advantage here. We're not going to look at the ending, because, well, I mean, that was the most interesting part, that piece sacrifice and attack, in my opinion. Again, if you want to have a deeper look at the ending, you can do that yourself. Svidler had his chances to win, and again, at this point, he was much better. But Caruana held on in the end, and Svidler wasn't able to win, which must be frustrating for him. He still sits at -1, I think. And Caruana, with holding out, now sits only a point back of the leaders. So finally, we come to the only decisive game of the round, and that was Nakamura's victory over Topalov. And poor Topalov, man. Clear last place now with 2 out of 7. Anyways, so he was black here against Nakamura. This position was reached out of a Slav. He went knight f3 check, which is okay. Bishop takes f3, e takes f3. So what he's managed to do is establish a pawn on f3, where it's going to be annoying for White to deal with. So now, although he's probably positionally worse on account of it's not obvious where his play is coming from. Meanwhile, White is systematically undermining this pawn chain on the queen side. But now Topalov's introduced this pawn on f3, which is going to become a randomizing factor in the future. And in due time, he's going to blow the position open and try to start attacking things. So obviously, if White tries to take this guy, then his knight on a4 is going to hang. So he can't do that. Instead, play b takes c6, continuing with his plan, which is to undermine this pawn chain. So now he's gotten to the base of the c6 d5 pawn chain, and now he's going to start attacking this guy. That's the plan, anyways. Although, yeah, Topalov decided to randomize it by sacking a bishop, as one does. So he plays bishop takes c5, d takes c5, and d4. And this is a really clever idea, actually. Because, well, White hasn't castled, which wasn't a problem before that White hasn't castled because the center was closed. Now, at the mere cost of a bishop, the center is not going to be closed anymore. On the other hand, it cost him a bishop. So this is interesting. Although I guess he didn't want to sit around and wait for his queen side to just fall apart, so he decided to do something active, which is a good idea. So he takes d4, queen takes d4. So yeah, it's a piece for a pawn, but the center's open. And in fact, White's next move is forced, and that's to castle. The computer says there's no other alternative to keep an advantage anyways. Like, okay, for example, if you take on f3, rook a3 happens, and you're in this awkward pin, and like rook e8 check is coming, and something like knight to d5 might be coming. And yeah, it optically doesn't look like there's that much, but considering it's quite dangerous, considering that now it's too late to just castle away because your bishop will hang. So this is an interesting idea, and White can and should castle, but this of course does look a little scary because if this queen could get to g2 somehow, that would be checkmate. Unfortunately for Topalov, there's no way of doing that in the foreseeable future, on account of you can put your queen on g4, but you can never get it to h3, because the moment you put it on h3, your f3 pawn will hang. So you never actually have the chance to give mate on g2. On the other hand, you can try, and this is something White always has to worry about. So in a sense, this queen is tied down to the d1 square, because he always has to be ready to meet queen h3 with queen takes f3, or else he'll just be dead. So fast forwarding a second, Black has managed to exert some pressure along the d file. And so White decided right now to get out of this with queen b3, which, I mean, we've discussed earlier, this queen's sort of tied down to the f3 pawn, but in this case, he's creating a greater threat, which overrides that, and that's to take on f7, and then take on g7 mate. So Black covered that, And they repeated moves for a bit, and then Nakamura decided to deviate with knight d1, which, I mean, it's an attempt to keep playing for the win, but it's perhaps not objectively a good decision. Topalov went knight d5, and he went on to lose because he ended up being unable to prove sufficient compensation for his missing piece. But I think, according to the computer anyway, this was his chance to get his compensation that he so desires with the move queen f5. Now, this move has 2 points. Most obviously, it attacked the c5 pawn, and it's threatening to gain a second pawn for the piece, which is sort of getting towards enough material for it. But the other sort of more hidden threat is it's clearing the rook along the 4th rank. So the other threat's now rook takes h4, which, if white naive to defend the c5 pawn, rook takes h4 is a huge problem on account of threats down the h file, and you can't take this due to this being a nice checkmate. So probably best is something like rook e3. And then it's actually possible to put the queen on d7 now that this rook left the 7th rank, and now these guys are in a skewer. And black will probably end up winning his piece back, actually. So that was probably Topalov's chance, although this queen f5 move with points of attacking this pawn, threatening this, and queen d7 with a skewer if the rook moves, this isn't at all natural looking, and that's a very sort of computery way to play the position. So it's understandable that Topalov was unable to find this, and he ended up playing knight d5, and quickly he found himself without compensation. King h2 means that there's no longer any queen h3 threats to worry about, so this queen can go wherever it wants now. And really, by this point, it's just an extra piece for Nakamura. And Topalov resigned at this point, simply now being a rook down. So that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching, and like and subscribe if you want and whatever, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.